Welcome to the next video on early Elizabethan England with a focus on key topic 3, Elizabethan society in the age of exploration. Today we're going to be looking at part 2, which is the problem of the poor. So our focus on content today is to look at the reasons for the increase in poverty and vagabondage during these years, as well as the change in attitudes and policies towards the poor in the early Elizabethan period. First of all, we need to look at the idea of the reasons for the increase in poverty during this period. One of the key ones is to look at the idea of how the population grew over this period of time. Between 1558 and 1603, the population grew by around about 35% over this period, but there was also rapid growth in urban areas such as towns and cities, including London. Those lived in London and other surrounding towns and cities obviously were not living in rural areas and did not grow their own food for sustenance like those in the countryside. Along with this, the job market changed quite dramatically, particularly within the towns, and food production did not increase with the rate of the population. With simple supply and demand economics, is that if the supply of food reduces, the price of it automatically increases. So bad harvests in several years during the Elizabethan period led to supply issues, and that therefore led to price increases in staple goods, particularly with regards to grain and bread. Because there were more people to feed with the growing population, that led to food prices rising. As well as this, the wages did not match this particular price inflation. In the rural areas, the rent for farming land grew quite dramatically. And linked onto that is the idea of the changes in the countryside over this time period. So, for example, there was a repurposing of farmland for sheep farming. This was mainly due to cloth during this period be increasing quite dramatically by about 80%. As a result of this, land was taken from growing crops to sheep farming because it was a more lucrative business for the landowners. The enclosure of land at this point meant that fewer people were required to farm it, and this was also evident in how sheep farming wasn't actually requiring as many labourers. This therefore led to high rural unemployment and led to people leaving the rural areas to try and find work in the towns and cities. The other key issue with regards to enclosure is that on common land, where anyone could farm for subsistence, i.e. to farm crops to survive, the enclosure of land of this common land meant that subsistence farming couldn't happen anymore. So this increase in poverty also led to an increase in vagabondage as well. Now this very much concerned the Elizabethans because vagabonds didn't actually form part of their hierarchical society. So they act outside of society as well as outside of the law. So particularly the rich in society were very concerned about vagabondage as it threatens law and order of the society itself. We mentioned before about the idea of what was happening in the rural areas. So the enclosure, along with rising prices, led to what was called rural depopulation. So people were leaving the rural areas, looking for work in towns and cities, and there wasn't any for them. So that led to an increase in vagabondage in the towns and cities themselves. Now there tended to be an evolution of unemployment, sort of like peaks and troughs, over the course of the early Elizabethan period, and this tended to happen during trade embargoes with Spain and the Netherlands. So during these particular periods of time, many turned to begging or life crime in order to survive. In addition to this, vagabonds were treated very harshly by the authorities. It tends to lead to whipping and the death penalty as their punishments, and this was reintroduced in the Vagrancy Act of 1572. However, during this time, there were changing attitudes towards the poor. So the poor were pretty much split into two groups. So you had the impotent or the deserving poor, where Elizabethans were sympathetic to those who were unable to work due to either age, illness, or disability, and therefore there was a poor relief that was paid by a special tax. It's very much similar to unemployment and disability benefits that we see in the 21st century. The justices of the peace in the local areas were the ones that would organise this poor relief to make sure it goes to the people that deserve it. And there was also a change in attitude in the sense of helping those that are less fortunate was being seen as a Christian duty. The second group of people was to do with the able-bodied poor, and they were treated more harshly during the early stages of the Elizabethan period because they were seen as being idle rather than not being able to work. As mentioned previously, the Vagrancy Act meant that they were whipped and imprisoned for acts of vagrancy after 1572. In addition, later on in 1576, houses of correction were to be built in each county, and those that refused to work were basically sent to those houses of correction. So there were three main government actions on the poor during the early Elizabethan period. The first is a Statute of Artificers in 1563. The aim of this was to ensure that poor relief was collected and then distributed to those that required it. So the key features to look for this one is anyone who refused to pay poor rates could be imprisoned, and officials failing to organise poor relief could receive a fine. The second one was the aforementioned Vagabonds Act of 1572, and the aim for this was to deter the act of vagrancy in towns and cities. So the key features of this one was that vagrants were to be whipped with a hole drilled through each ear on the first occasion. They were to be imprisoned for a second offence, and then they would face a death penalty if they were caught being a vagrant for the third time. It did, however, have some positive aspects. It established the idea of a national poor rate rather than being left up to the localities and parishes. And the JPs were to keep a register of the poor, as well as towns and cities being given responsibility to find work for those that were able-bodied. The last one that was introduced by the government in the 1570s was the Poor Relief Act of 1576. The aim of this was to distinguish between those that were able-bodied and those that were impotent in terms of the poor, so the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. The key features of this was that the JPs provided the able-bodied poor with wool and raw materials to enable them to make things to then be able to sell on. And the second feature is that those that refused this work were then sent to the House of Correction that we looked at in the previous slide. So now focusing on the impact of the government action on the poor. The positive outcomes of it was that there was actually a recognition of unemployment being a genuine problem rather than labelling it as idleness. The second positive impact was that giving the unemployed things to make gave those that were poor independence and dignity. There were obviously negative aspects of it, is that poverty didn't actually deal wholeheartedly with the issue of poverty, and this continued to be a major issue throughout Elizabeth's reign. And there were also local differences in the way that the poor were treated. So, for example, in London and Ipswich, they were treated better and received more help from the state than those in other areas of England. So let's have a look at a couple of questions now that are likely to come up in a 2022 series. So one possible question that could come up is the idea of explaining why attitudes towards the poor changed in the early Elizabethan period. Just a reminder that on a 12-mark question, we need to think about the idea of three aspects of knowledge. So one aspect of knowledge we can talk about is to talk about the idea of the attitudes change because of the issue of vagrancy. We can talk about the idea of why vagrancy was a threat to law and order, and we can talk about the idea of that rural depopulation going to towns and cities looking for work. And what did it lead to? It led to government action, it led to the Vagabonds Act being introduced, and you can then discuss a couple of features regarding the Vagabonds Act. The second aspect of knowledge you can look at is a recognition of unemployment being a problem. So we can talk about the idea of, well, how is that? How was unemployment a problem? So that's to do with the idea of poor trading relations with Spain and the Netherlands, and that therefore leads to a drop in trade and therefore leads to a drop in unemployment. And then you can talk about the idea of the Poor Relief Act introducing the provision of materials for those that are able-bodied to make items to sell. The third aspect is to look at the idea of the impotent poor and that change in attitude of those that are unable to work due to either age or illness. So the government action on that is the establishment of the national poor rate and the idea that the change in attitude is the Christian duty to help out those that are less fortunate. Don't forget that the 12-mark question doesn't require an introduction or a conclusion. It is merely making sure that you have got enough in terms of evidence and then to explain why this led to a change in attitude. Another potential question that could come up is the idea of the 16-mark question. And a potential question that could come up is to look at the idea of what was the biggest cause in the increase of poverty. So this question is asking whether enclosure was the biggest cause of an increase in poverty, or was it something else? How far do you agree with it? The key thing to establish in the introduction is a criteria. And for this particular question, you would want to look at the idea of which factor contributed to the biggest increase in poverty. It's a nice, easy criteria to identify. So the three factors to discuss. Obviously, you have to look at the one that's within the question itself. So you discuss enclosure, you describe what enclosure is, and then explain why that contributes to an increase in poverty. The second factor to discuss is the idea of the growth in population. So describe what happened to the growth in population, i.e. there was a large population growth in towns and cities, or you could discuss about the idea that it increases by 35% over the course of the reign, and then explain why that contributes to an increase in poverty. And then the third factor is to look at the idea of rising prices. So you can describe what prices rose and why it contributes to an increase in poverty. So in terms of what prices rose, you can discuss about the drop in trade with Spain and the Netherlands. You can talk about the increase in the price of grain, which therefore made it very difficult to make bread at an affordable price. And then you can explain, well, because bread is a staple food within Elizabethan England, that therefore leads to poverty because the price of essential goods has increased. Now you have to remember that for the 16-mark question, it does require you to evaluate. So at the end of each paragraph, the key tip from my point of view is to say, how strong is that argument to being the biggest cause? How did it lead to the biggest increase? Is there, what strength of argument is there to suggest that it leads to the biggest increase? So the final kind of sentence that you put at the end of each paragraph is to say, this is a strong argument to suggest that it is the biggest cause of an increase in poverty because, or this is a weaker argument to suggest it is the biggest cause of an increase in poverty because. So therefore, you're kind of starting to prioritize towards a judgment. So an example of a judgment, because you can actually argue for all three of these being the biggest driver of poverty in the Elizabethan period. But I've gone for the idea of enclosure. This caused the biggest increase because the way that enclosure worked was that the land that was built for crops was repurposed into sheep farming. And therefore, because there was not enough crops to grow, there wasn't enough food to provide for the growing population of England, and therefore it creates food shortages, especially during periods of bad harvest. It therefore leads to high prices and therefore leads to an explosion in poverty. So that ends our session on the problem of the poor. Please make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel.